Okay, hey everyone, this is part two, okay, of this series on how God healed me and breaking spiritual contracts. And so I'm gonna try, I'm gonna try to summarize this, okay? So basically, how much do I share? What do I share? Because it can take a long time if I share too much. Um, Basically, in 2010, I went camping several times. I came home on one camping trip with a red circular rash on my hip. At the time, I didn't know what it was. I've never seen a rash like that before. So, what do? You go to Google. So, I went to Google, I'm typing it in, and something came up called ringworm. And so I was like, oh, it's just ringworm. No problem, right? And so I went about my day, didn't think anything of it. And that was because I didn't know anything about a bullseye rash, okay? And it's even interesting that it's called a bullseye rash because it's like you're a target and the bullseye is the anyways, that's I digress. But anyways, I realize now in retrospect that it was a bullseye rash and that it was indicative of something called Lyme disease, but I didn't know Lyme disease even existed. I've never heard of it. I didn't know what it was. And so, because I didn't know anything about it, I didn't go to the doctors. I didn't do anything to try to like get better, right? And it's unfortunate because what happens is if you get Lyme disease, it's usually from a bug bite, right? So usually a tick bite, although other insects can carry the Lyme disease bacteria, right? It's most commonly known as something you get from a tick bite. So I realized I think it was 3 years later in 2013. Um, I was watching a lot of documentaries at this time, trying to figure out like what was going on with me, what was causing me to be sick. And so I would stumble upon different documentaries about like chronic fatigue syndrome or whatever. And I was like, oh, maybe that's what I have, right? And ironically, I was diagnosed with that later, but I realize now that it was actually the Lyme disease that was causing those things and the fibromyalgia and the POTS and all these other things, right? So, anyways, I found this documentary. So, anyways, I'm on YouTube. I'm watching these documentaries on like different chronic illnesses. And you know how like it'll recommend a video for you? It recommended a movie called Under Our Skin. And um I watched the movie a couple times. The first time I watched it, I was like, "Oh my gosh, this movie's so sad. Like I feel so bad for these people, but I'm so glad I don't have Lyme because I don't want to have to navigate that. That's insane." And yeah. And then I watched it again, probably like a month later. And the second time that I watched it, I was like, oh, I think I have Lyme. And all the dart, oh my gosh, I can't speak. And all the dots started connecting about the bullseye rash, how it happened when I was camping. We even had a family dog who, he had this thing on his skin and it looked like a little growth. But now in retrospect, I'm like, oh, it was probably an engorged tick. Because depending on the tick, when they expand, they usually get lighter in color. So it literally looks like it can be part of your skin. And so he had this growth on him. And all of a sudden it was gone one day, but there was like marks, right? And our dog actually died shortly after. He basically bled to death. It was horrible. He went from being active and healthy and he had a ton of energy to being lethargic, not wanting to ever play, to being in pain suddenly when we would try to pet him. So he was really sick, and it got to the point where we would take him out to go to the bathroom, and he would literally be peeing like blood, right? And we took him to the vet, and they didn't really know what was wrong with him. But now, in retrospect, I'm like, oh, he probably got it. He probably got some sort of infection too from the tick bite, and that was an engorged tick. Anyways, so he passed away, and this happened like after this camping trip too, because we brought him on the camping trip with us. So, so that happened. And I remember after seeing the movie, I was like, okay, I got to go to the doctors. I got to get tested. I got all these things, right? And if you know anything about Lyme, you know that it's a very controversial disease, right? It's a political disease. And so it's not that easy to get testing for it because a lot of doctors don't want to test for it. Just because it's one of those things where they can get in trouble if they treat you for it. Um, but I'm not going to get into all the politics of that because this video is going to be like 10 hours long if I do. But you can check the movie out on, it's on YouTube. It's called Under Our Skin, and it gets into everything. It explains why, it has to do with the CDC and the IDSA and the guidelines, and anyway, so that's that. And so I saw that documentary. There was a character in the movie. Her name was Mandy, and I was like, I look like her. She's me. We're the same. Because she had lots of muscle issues. I had lots of muscle issues. And I should mention that when I first was dealing with like my I guess illness, right? It started off as like chronic infections in the sense that I was always getting sick with some type of infection. So sometimes it would be bronchitis, sometimes it would move to I would just get over that and then I'd get pneumonia and then that would get better and then I would have laryngitis and it would just repeat to the point where I was like I would go back to the doctors, I'd get antibiotics, I would get off the antibiotics, then I'd go back, I'd get more antibiotics. And it's funny because every time I was on the antibiotics, I actually felt a little bit better. Um, you know, but I didn't, yeah. In the beginning stages, I didn't piece it together yet, right? And then it got to the point where my symptoms started like affecting my muscles, my mobility, the ability to walk, the ability to talk, the ability to remember things, even just talking with people. And you know how we talk and we have something called like word recall where we can just think about something and say it. We know what we're thinking about, and so we use the word, right? But I couldn't do that. I started forgetting what things were called all the time to the point where it got so embarrassing. And I would be speaking to friends in the middle of a sentence. I would just forget completely what I was even saying, what I was talking about. And I started to get super embarrassed, and I started to develop social anxiety around this time because no longer was I able to speak clearly like I used to. No longer was I able to remember the words when I needed them like I used to. It was very hard to communicate. And then I started having seizures. I had seizures pretty much every single night, and sometimes it would escalate to the point where I would have multiple seizures in a day. Sometimes my family would have to call the ambulance, and I would go to the hospital if my seizure wouldn't stop at a certain point. And so it was crazy. On my worst days, I would be in a wheelchair because I developed something called POTS, but it was so bad to the point where I couldn't stand for long periods of time without feeling like I was going to pass out. So I needed a wheelchair to be able to get out. Or I would use a cane sometimes if like I could be a little more functional, but sometimes I would have issues like with balance. It was just everything. Everything was affected. I had chronic pain. I would be crying in pain so often. There would also be nights where, on my, like, guys, I don't even like to think about this because it was such a traumatic thing that I went through that I don't like to remember it because it was just so hard. But I remember there were even nights where and days where I would sit in a room in darkness because I couldn't even listen to music. I couldn't even watch TV. I couldn't look at something that was bright. I couldn't even look at my phone because I would have head pressure that was so bad to the point where it felt like somebody was like squeezing my head. And so if I would listen to music when this was going on, it was painful. It was like actually painful. And then trying to watch TV was the same thing because it would be too bright and the brightness was too painful. So I literally would sit in a room by myself and I would just cry because that's all I could do. But then I couldn't even cry too much because it would hurt too much. And so it was honestly, when I tell you, it was miserable. It was miserable. It was horrible. That's what I was dealing with for like almost 10 years. And it's a long story and I won't get into all the specifics, but I went to the States. I found a doctor who was a Lyme literate naturopathic doctor. She ended up diagnosing me with late stage neurological Lyme disease. And I came back to Canada and I found a doctor who was actually able to do the treatment for me because I couldn't afford the treatment in the States. It was too expensive. But at least in Canada, like at least the antibiotics were covered and things like that. So I started a treatment regimen. I did like IV antibiotics, I did oral antibiotics, I did a herbal treatment. I tried some other things too. And yeah, I remember when I started the treatment and everything too, I was like so excited because I'm like, finally, like I know, like, and I should say as well, when I saw the naturopathic doctor in Canada, he actually ran the tests that needed to be run. And he did find out that, I did test positive for certain tick-borne infections. And so we went to treat it, right? And again, you have to remember that this started in 2010. I didn't get diagnosed until 2013. So by this point, the bacteria had spread in my body. And that's why I was so sick because it wasn't all killed off, right? And because of the crazy bacteria that it is, right? It was able to hide from my own immune system. It was able to hide from the antibiotics. I had to be on like we would rotate certain antibiotics to kill the different forms that the bacteria would go into. And this sounds so crazy, even just like saying this out loud. I'm like, it sounds crazy, like something from a movie, right? But it's like the Lyme bacteria, if you were to take, for example, an antibiotic that's supposed to kill like a cell wall deficient form of a bacteria, what the Lyme bacteria does is it actually can protect itself and go into like a cyst form, right? And so to protect itself from the antibiotics, but then what you need to do is take antibiotics that are meant to kill cyst form of the bacteria, right? And then there's L shape. So I literally was on a protocol where we would switch different meds around. I would take IV meds. Eventually I learned how to do my IVs at home. And I reacted the best to the IV meds. The oral medications, like, eventually messed up my gut. And, I'm grateful for it though, because it taught me a lot about like holistic treatments and diet and herbal remedies. And so to this day, like, I actually have like a ton of herbal tinctures in my fridge and stuff just because you never know, like cold and flu season, right? Like I always have stuff on standby for like me and my family. And if my niece gets sick, I'm like, okay, we can take this. If somebody's having allergies, I'm like, okay. And I'm like, I know that God created those things for us, right? In Genesis, right? That's what we had for food. We had plants, we had vegetables and fruits, right? That's what we ate. That's how it was in a place of perfection, right? That was the diet. And then when sin entered the picture, then we had to kill animals for food. But before sin, right? You know, we ate plants and all these things, right? And so yeah, so I was doing my treatment. The treatment was crazy because it causes something called a Herxheimer reaction, which means that when you're killing off the bacteria, all of the toxins that are in these bacteria, they all basically like explode into your bloodstream at the same time. And so it causes you to get really, 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 really sick. Okay. Um, yeah, to the point where it was a nightmare the way that I described treatment. And it probably is similar to how people feel when they're on chemotherapy because again, chemo is very toxic, right? um and so yeah, so I would deal with the Herxheimer stuff. I was on treatment. I was paying for all these things. I was doing it for years, off and on intermittently, just because I couldn't consistently pay to stay on it like all the time. And so I did that. And then eventually in 2019, it got to the point where my heart was now getting affected, and I basically was in and out of the hospital with like heart attack symptoms and palpitations, and just like I remember from my first aid that they said if you ever felt like you were going to have a heart attack, take an aspirin. So I used to carry aspirin with me because, again, these symptoms I was having, they were so frequent at this point where I was like, well, if I need to pop an aspirin, at least I know I'm not going to have a clot, right? And so, yeah, so I was dealing with that. At this time, I had a son who was a few years old. And because of my son, I was like, you know what? I need to get better. I need to get better for him. I'm so sorry. My sister's texting me and it goes through my phone, so it's going to keep beeping. I apologize. But yeah, but because of my son, he was like my driving force to get better. And I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, it's been year after year after year after year after year, not better yet. And so, and again, spending tens of thousands of dollars, like all of these things. And I kind of came up with like my own plan for healing, like a little checklist, right? And I was like, okay, I'm going to change my diet, right? And so I did. Before, when I was doing my treatment, my naturopath had me cut out gluten and try to be low sugar and things like that. But at this point, I was like, I need to cut everything out. And so I went to like the extreme end where I was like doing the alkaline vegan diet. So I basically had like no sugar, no gluten. I ate a lot of fruit. I ate a lot of vegetables. I, yeah. And even when it came to vegetables, there was only like a handful that I would actually eat because I stayed away from like hybrid foods, right? Anyways, whatever. It's a whole thing. So I did that. And what else? I did that. So that was the nutritional part. The emotional part, I was like, okay, so I've removed toxins from my diet. I also need to remove toxins from people. So I need to get rid of toxic relationships, all these things. And so I already broke up with my son's father that I was with because, again, it was not a healthy relationship. And so that was cut out. That was good, right? And yeah, so we weren't the only time we would talk is when we had to deal with like our son, right? So we were trying to co-parent, and it was really hard. But I was like, okay, he's out of my life in that way though. Like, I don't have to deal with him in that way. So I was doing that. I was looking at like friendships and stuff as well, and figuring out like, okay, who's who are genuinely my friends, who aren't. uh you know Anyways, so that was like the emotional part. And I also saw a counselor at this time. And yeah, and she kind of helped. She didn't realize she did this because it was, I think, just kind of like one of those random God things. But like, she actually helped me to see some things that I needed to pray about without even doing it, because she wasn't even a Christian. So that also overlapped with like my mental, right? Because I knew that I had picked up some unhealthy coping mechanisms and thought patterns, and I had become very toxic in my thinking, very pessimistic, very like just when you're dealing with something for that long, right? And you're always in pain, you're always feeling sick, right? Just think about it. People don't like getting the flu for like a week, and that's a week, right? Imagine dealing with a flu that never goes away, and you're always fatigued, you always feel sick, you have headaches, you're throwing up. Like, You may have physical pain in your body, right? Like whatever it is, just imagine if it was prolonged, right? It would be easy to get discouraged and to, again, be pessimistic. So that's kind of where I was. I realized though that my thinking was toxic. So I was like, I have to correct it. So another thing that I started doing was really focusing on like gratitude and trying to just be appreciative for like um, the things that I still had or the things that I still could enjoy. So I would like force myself to think about things every day that I could be, you know, grateful for. And so I turned that into like a routine where every day I would, again, think about these things. And my goal was to try to create new neural pathways in the brain so that instead of being predisposed to being, what's the word? Predisposed to being pessimistic, I wanted to be optimistic. But I was like, in order to get optimistic, I have to change my thought patterns and I need to create new habits so that new new brain connections can be made to the point where okay, now that's the new normal, right? So that was the mental part. I was trying to deal with the mental. So we got the diet, we got the emotional, getting rid of the toxins and stuff, the relationships, right? And then the mental, and again, the counseling tied into that. And then there was physical, because I had become very sedentary, because again, I couldn't do very much, right? Like if I did stuff that required a lot of like exertion, I would get quite sick. And sometimes I would literally be stuck. Oh my gosh, my hair's so thick right now. What is happening? What is going on? Anyways, sorry, distraction. Um, but um, but yeah, so then the physical, I realized, oh my gosh, I've become so sedentary. Like I need to move my body again somehow. Obviously, I knew I wasn't going to be able to do crazy cardio or go running or anything, but I started incorporating stretching into my life. I also started doing yoga, which I had to repent for later. And yeah, some people say that yoga is just this thing that's harmless, but you really do have to be careful because I do think that you are opening up a door when you participate in that, just because of the roots of where it comes from, especially when you get into like the Eastern mysticism part of it and like the Kundalini spirit that's kind of used in yoga. You just have to be very careful. Like when I did it, I wasn't doing like the Kundalini yoga, but still, I didn't realize that I was still opening up a door that shouldn't have been open. So I did have to repent for that. And I asked God to forgive me, and I don't do yoga anymore. But so I did physical stuff. And so that was like, again, with the goal of trying to, reverse like the sedentary lifestyle that, again, I had now adapted to because I was so sick. And then the last element was spiritual. And I was like, okay, so I'm getting rid of all these other things that are toxic, whether it's diet, right? Whether it's mental habits and whatever, toxic relationships and friendships, right? And then I was like, what about spiritual toxins? Like, is there a possibility that I could have spiritual toxins? And I remember in the beginning of my chronic, I guess, health journey, I used to go to people and ask them for prayer, for healing. And in the beginning, I was so like pumped and I was like, God can do it. Like, but my position was always that of like, even if he doesn't though, like God is still good, right? Like even if like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Like our God is able to save us from this furnace, right? Like he's able to deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down and worship your gods, right? And so that was kind of my like mentality with healing. Like I knew God could, but I was like, well, even if he doesn't, he's still good. And of course, that got tried, that got tested, that viewpoint, because again, it's easy to say that in the beginning, but when you wait 5 years in and the healing still doesn't come, and now you're worse off than you were before, do you really still think God is good, right? And so, again, around like the 9.5 period, at this point, my faith was struggling. I was really wrestling with God, and I was pleading with God night after night to help heal me, to help, like, if you're not going to excuse me, if you're not going to help me get better, can you take me, cuz like I can't live like this every day. This is ridiculous, and I have a son to take care of, and like, I don't want him to have a mom that's like this. And somehow, even in the middle of it all, I don't, it's honestly God, but he helped me to still be an amazing mom, even though I was dealing with all these things. Like, I'm not perfect, right? And I'm not going to say that did I do everything right all the time? No, because no parent knows what they're doing, right? It's literally like trial and error. Um, but I'm just so, how do I explain it? I'm just so happy because I was able to be there for my son, support my son, get him the help he needed as well. Like I was just, I'm just very proud of myself. And you know what? I'm going to give myself a pat on the back because with everything that I was dealing with, the fact that I was able to still focus on him so much and like his well being and like the things that he needed. And, even just taking him out places and going to the park or going, I don't know, just going downtown to like explore with him, with my friends and stuff. Like, I'm just very grateful that God sustained me through that so that I could do those things and so that I have those memories. Because again, I don't know how I did it. And there would be moments, if you've had a chronic illness, you can relate. But there's moments where you feel sick and then you kind of get a little bit of relief, right? It's like you might have it for a few days, you might have it for a few weeks, but then the symptoms inevitably, they always come back, right? And so whenever I would have these periods where I would have a little bit of relief, I was like, okay, it's time to do stuff with my son, like, and, even if I felt sick, like there's things that I would do to try to accommodate, right? I would, like if I was so fatigued, I would be like, hey, we'll hang out in mommy's room today. And I would bring coloring books and books onto the bed. And, I'd throw a movie on and we would just chill. But I still would have stuff for him to do to the point where it's like I could still be there with him. We could hang out together. If I had to order in food sometimes, I would do that, right? But but there were things that I was able to do so that he could still have fun and not realize that I was sick, right? And because I really didn't want him to see me being so sick, right? Anyway, so that was that. Anyway, so around this time, I'm thinking about the spiritual stuff, and I'm like, okay, this is the next part. Like, I got to tackle this. And around this time, again, I'm struggling with my faith. And at the point, sorry, and I'm at the point where I'm literally ready to like walk away from God because I'm just like, maybe you don't exist. I've been praying for years. I've been asking you for years, like to heal me or to take me or something, just do something. And like, I just felt like he wasn't listening or that he was like silent. And so, um, yeah, so I just felt really hurt. And again, this is my feelings. That doesn't mean it was the truth. This is just how I felt, okay? And so I felt like God wasn't there, like he wasn't listening, like he didn't care. And and so I was like, God, like I don't know if I can do this anymore. I don't know if I can trust in you anymore. Like I just, are you there? Am I stupid for praying to a God that maybe doesn't exist, maybe doesn't care, maybe doesn't listen? Like, and um and so around this time though, I was like, okay, I'm gonna give it like one more shot. I'm just gonna like, I'm gonna pray, against spiritual stuff anyways. But before I get there, so I saw my counselor, um and you know how sometimes when you see your counselor, like you kind of just chit chat before you like get into the actual session, right? We used to, anyways. And I remember she was like, "Oh, there's this TV show I was watching, and it was really interesting, super crazy. Like I can't believe it." And she started telling me about it, and I'm like, "Oh, that actually sounds quite interesting and fascinating. Like I might enjoy that." And she was talking about how like the episode had to do with like this cult and like it was crazy. And I was like, yeah, I want to watch it. So She told me what the show was called. She told me the episode because this show, every episode was like completely different and they weren't related. So they had different storylines, but this one was about the cults. So I start watching it one day, and then as I'm watching it, I'm like, what in the actual heck? It starts reminding me of the church that I grew up in that I knew was a cult eventually, right? Um, and I'm just like, there's way too many similarities between this show and between this church that I grew up in. This is so friggin' bizarre. And I remember in the show, there was this cult leader, and he had this like book that he used to like reference. And I remember in the show, the book had to do with like healing. Um, and this was, and not like physical healing, like more so like emotional healing, like a crossover between psychology and counseling kind of healing, but like in this cult setting. Anyway, so he's talking about this book in the show, and I remember like listening to it, and I was like, this book sounds so familiar. Like just the whole like idea sounds really like I've heard this before, and like isn't this another book? And so, so me being the person I am, I go to Google right away and I start searching this in, and I look up the book that was in the movie, and I'm like, is this a real book? And I don't remember if it was a real book or not, just because it's so long ago now. This is what, like five, what is it? It's like, yeah, like what, 5, 6 years ago now. So it's hard to remember, but I looked it up and I remember a bunch of like related books showed up, and there was this one book that I saw and I was like, oh, this is weird. I was like, I didn't even know books like this existed, but I'm like, I guess it would make sense. I just haven't, right? If you're not looking for something, you're not going to see it. And so there was this one book I saw about like psychic attacks or something, and I was like, what the heck, this is weird. And then I was like, who would write a book like this? And so again, remember, all of this is happening because of this show that my counselor just so happened to mention, right? And I said, oh, I'm going to watch it, right? So I look up the author of this book, and there's a picture, a black and white picture, and I freak out. And I freak out. I take a screenshot of this picture and I send this to my sister, and I'm like, who does this look like? Because I'm freaking out. This person looks identical to my mom. Okay. And like and again, guys, this video is not to bash her, it's not to put her down. So pray for her. Okay. I really have been struggling with making this video just because I wasn't sure how much to share, but I feel like some of these things are important because you may have been dealing with maybe a similar situation, and maybe this will help you. But if I'm a little bit too vague, I feel like because of the subject matter of this, it may not be helpful. But anyways, so she literally looked exactly like my mom. And so my sister, she's like, oh my gosh, that looks like mom. Like, where did you find this picture? Like, what in the world? Right. And so then I told her, like, oh my gosh, like it's like from a book. And like, anyways, so that starts happening. And remember, around this time, I'm already knowing that the spiritual toxin part is the part that I have to tackle next, right? And so, it just seemed like God was starting to open my eyes and show me and direct me to where I needed to pray, that it was my mom's side of the family, also praying for maybe any curses that have come from my mom or being in her womb, right? Um, just because, again, like if we look at the Bible, right, about like blessings, right, we know that a lot of times, not every time, because there's some exceptions, but we know that like there is a birthright blessing that would go to like the eldest son, right? And so, that's something that would happen in the Bible. And because the enemy is a counterfeit and he can't create things on his own like that, he can only take what God has done and corrupt it. And so, in like the occult and in Satanism and things like that, they will dedicate their firstborn to the occult, right? So, when we're as Christians, we baptize our children, we basically are saying, hey, like we want our children to grow up to know God. And so again, the enemy does the opposite. And yeah, so I felt like everything was pointing to, again, specific side of the family to pray about. But I also knew, so it's almost like everything kind of just connected, right? And, I remembered all the things that like I had heard about my mom's side of the family, about the occult, about the Masons, about the Eastern Star, and it kind of just made sense because I was like, oh, they were also very, very, very successful. And like the last name is well known in that area, right? And so I was like, okay, maybe I do need to pray about this because even my mom, right, she told me what she grew up in to the extent where it overlaps with some conspiracy theories, right? On like SRA, which is not a conspiracy theory, but a lot of people like to say it is because I think they're just trying to cover up the truth of what's actually happening in these things. And so, in my testimonial video, I think I mentioned that I grew up with uh, a parent who had multiple personality disorder, and it's because of what she grew up in the occult, and because of what she had to witness, all of the trauma that she had to go through. And so, like, when I say pray for her, right? Unfortunately, we don't have a relationship anymore, but I still pray for her. And, I just hope that one day she'll understand what love actually is and joy, and that she, yeah, because I feel like when people feel that from God, it's like they don't have to hurt people anymore. When God changes people's hearts, it's like, you know because again, like money and all these things, it can only do so much. It's not going to comfort you. Right? And money disappears too. You can have it one day and the next day it can be gone. So anyway, so yeah, so I knew that like my family on that side had a lot of sketchy stuff, and that they were involved in some things, right? And I also did like, I remember, I think it was around the same time too. I was really interested in like figuring out my background, my history, like where I came from, because I'm mixed with a bunch of different ethnicities, right? And so I was trying to figure out like, okay, like where on my dad's side, like where do we come from? Do we come from Africa? Do we come from the Caribbean? Are we just indigenous? Are we a mixture of indigenous and African? Are we none of them? Are we just American, right? Trying to figure all these things out. So I really went down the rabbit hole on my dad's side of the family, and I was super excited about all the things I was learning about, and like the Underground Railroad and how we came to Canada, through this, and also through the British loyalist ships, right? And all these crazy things. And I'm like, yo, this is like part of history. And some of my family on my dad's side, they were part of like the first group of like Afro Canadian soldiers to ever be a thing, and like the Canadian military. And even the Canadian military didn't want them to join at first. They refused because of the color of their skin. So they're in like museums and stuff like that. So that was cool figuring that out. But then it got to a point where I was like, oh, I should probably look into like my mom's side. But I was very hesitant because I didn't want to, because I was like, I don't know what I'm going to find. And I don't know if I'm going to like what I'm going to find. So I started researching, and sure enough, it was weird. And I realized that on her side, it went back to like Scotland and Ireland. And, it kind of, for me, it kind of tied into the whole like Scottish rite. And yeah, and so I was like, oh, I was like, it seems like this goes like way, way back, like way, way back, right? And to the point where I was like, okay, this is kind of crazy, but like, maybe I should pray against it. And so, yeah, so I remember this one day, I was like, okay, this is the story that gets crazy. So, trigger warning, if you don't like, stories about like demonic things or whatever, you can leave if you need to. But this is where things get crazy. So I remember this one day, I'm in my room. I sit on the floor, on the carpet, right? In front of my bed, and I'm just like, okay, I'm just gonna pray against these things. And at the time, I didn't realize that what I was doing is that I was breaking these spiritual contracts that have been made from way back when. And because I was the firstborn, right, on my mom's side of the family, and I knew my mom didn't break these contracts, right? I knew that, like now in retrospect, I knew that I was the one who was the generational curse breaker on her side of the family. So my dad already did it for his side, and now he passed on the torch, and now I did it for my mom's side of the family. And so I'm sitting on the floor and I'm praying, and I'm like, okay, God, like I'm just gonna pray this. I don't even know. I'm not expecting anything to happen, okay? And so I start praying, and yeah, so I'm just like, God, I just pray against any curses that have been placed over me from while I was in my mother's womb. I just come out of agreement of, whatever oaths have been made in the past, family members who've been involved in like Satanism and all these things. Like, I just rebuke these things in the name of Jesus. And like, um, yeah, and again, not expecting anything to happen. But all of a sudden, my door is closed while I'm praying. And all of a sudden, I look over to where the door is, and underneath, I see this like dark gray and black cloud. That's how I describe it. It's like a mixture of like smoke and cloud, okay? And it's coming in from under the door, and it starts like filling up the room. And at the time I'm like, am I tripping? Like, is this actually happening? Because what is happening right now? So it comes into the room, it starts filling it up, and as soon as it does that, it's like there's this like presence in the room, this like dark demonic presence in the room, right? It kind of reminds me of like these movies that you'll see when there's a villain, and sometimes there'll be like a cloud that follows the villain or whatever, right? But it's like this happened, and all of a sudden it starts, um the cloud and smoke starts turning into like a tunnel, okay? And it just starts going straight up into my room. And I remember, I was just super confused, and to this day I still don't understand the whole tunnel thing. I don't know what that was about. So if you have any knowledge about that, that'd be cool if you could share it. The only thing that I've heard of is like when people have near death experiences, how they feel like they're in a tunnel and they see a bright light at the end of the tunnel. That's the only thing I can think of. Um, but anyway, so there's this dark tunnel that forms in my room. I look up, right? And all of a sudden, it feels like I'm being lifted off the ground to the point where I look down and I just see my feet dangling, right? And I can't do anything in this moment. And it just felt like this demonic force was trying to pull me into this tunnel. And again, don't know what that means, but there was definitely not a light at the end of the tunnel. It was just dark, okay? But as all of this is going on, I had this like knowing that, whatever was going on, that this demonic spirit was like trying to make me scared. That was the whole point. The whole point of like the cloud and the tunnel and trying to like lifting me up off the ground and trying to suck me up into this thing, right? I knew that it was all about fear, trying to get me to be in a place of fear, because remember, I'm coming out against these things. I'm praying these things, not understanding what I'm really doing, right? I'm just doing it. And all of a sudden, it's like I was actually poking the bear, and the bear decided to come out, right? And so I remember like as this like demonic force is trying to like pull me into this tunnel, it's like I'm like stuck in this place where like I can't go any further, and I can't, like, I'm still not on the ground. So I'm like stuck. And I remember like just saying like, I'm not afraid of you. I'm not scared of you. And like, this stops now. Like, basically saying, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And I remember like after saying that, I got thrown to the ground, and then all of a sudden the tunnel, it turned into like a wall now. So it's still smoky and gray and black, but then it turns into a wall. Okay. And then all of a sudden in the wall, still gray and black, I see a face appear. and the face is also like gray, okay? And all of a sudden, so I'm thrown down after I say all this stuff, right? And so, like, in the name of Jesus, like, I rebuke you and all these things, right? And like, you no longer like have control over like this bloodline, right? Like for me and my future descendants, right? And so this face appears in the smoke, and all of a sudden I recognize that it's my mom, the person that I was praying against with the curses, because I felt like God was showing me um, that maybe she wasn't fully out of what she grew up in, because and again, this is, I don't even like talking about this. It's so hard to talk about this and make this video, but like she grew up in the occult, right? And so if you grow up in the occult, they want you they want you to carry on the lineage, right? And they want your kids to carry on the lineage, and then their kids to, right? It's again, when you make a contract, they want it to be something that continues the same way that God, right? When we follow him, right? Again, same thing. Like God wants to have dominion over our lives and our kids' lives and our kids' kids, right? And so yeah, so I see her, and like right away it's like I knew, like, oh, she curse me too, right? Like did she actually like verbally cursed me when I was in her womb because of what she grew up in as well. And so I remember looking and seeing her, and all of a sudden she just started screaming, okay? But I couldn't hear anything, and that's the interesting part. I couldn't hear her screaming, but I saw her screaming. So it's almost like she was mute, but I could tell she was screaming, and she just looked like she was in pain and just like, right? In the middle of this gray smoky cloud. And then all of a sudden her like her face started contorting, and her jaw just started like stretching. And like, I know this sounds crazy, but this is just what happened, okay? And I'm healed now, so say what you want. um and so her jaw stretched, it got contorted, and all of a sudden, like 2 seconds later, all gone, disappeared. Everything disappeared. The cloud was gone, the smoke was gone, her face was, everything was gone. And I was just left in my room by myself. Like, did that just happen? did, am I like losing my brain? Like, am I losing my mind? Am I going crazy? And yeah, and ever since that day, I was healed. No more illness, no more Lyme, no more wheelchair, no more seizures, no more, I don't know, everything. All the stuff I explained, the head pressure, right? Everything, all of it gone. To the point where I can work out now. I can do things that I haven't been able to do in years. And it has been years now, too, because like I said before, there'd be moments where you'd get a little bit of relief, right? But then the symptoms would always come back, right? This will be the test to see if I'm actually healed, to see if like I stay pain free, symptom free for like a long time, right? So sure enough, it goes from like days of not feeling sick to weeks, and then from weeks to months, and then from months to years, to now. I believe it's at yeah, like about 6 years, I think, maybe 5, 6 years that I've been healed now. And I haven't had to go to the hospital. I haven't had to go to the doctors except to get like work stuff, right? Because sometimes when you get a new job, you got to get them to fill out paperwork. But other than that, like, I don't know, it's crazy. And like, I have people who have known me since I was sick, and like it's just crazy too. And even them, they're like, "Oh, we've been praying for you for so long, and it's amazing to see you healed now." Because I've shared, my healing, on like social media and stuff. But the thing that let me know that it was also legitimate is because shortly after that, I want to say a few months after, the whole healing thing happened. And I knew I was healed at this point because it was like already a few months and I was like, okay, like I feel better. And so I started telling people what God did. I was telling people my crazy story, my crazy experience, but I didn't realize that I was telling the wrong people because, like I said, my friend who I thought was a Christian, who is now a witch, dating a Satanist, right? Um, I told her and I told a bunch of other people, and next thing you know, right? Um, I had to like get up and leave pretty quick after that. And I think again, it's one of those things where like the enemy doesn't like to be exposed. And even with the occult, like I forget the definition for it, but I think it means like in secret or something. Like that's the whole point, right? They don't want you to expose those things. Even when you do secret societies and stuff, that's why you have to do the oaths, right? And you have to be initiated in because they want to make sure you're not just going to go blab these things to other people. And that's why we hear of whistleblowers and what happens to whistleblowers and stuff like that. And so um yeah, so the fact that I was hit with some pretty heavy warfare a few months after that, after I really started telling people, and then I also started finding out more stuff about my family too, and I had people, ask me questions randomly and be like, "Oh, do you know the real reason why your dad left?" And I was like, "No, what do you mean?" And so that kind of led into finding out more crazy stuff about that side of the family and realizing like, yo, these guys are like psychopaths. And yeah, and so I walked away from them and yeah, so here I am. I'm healed, I'm better, and yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things where again I wasn't expecting anything to happen, but something did, and I'm better now. And so I share this with you um, in hopes that maybe it can help somebody that's dealing with something similar, so that you can find some sort of like, I don't know, resolution or freedom, or just because it's a lot. And again, even with illness, again, like sometimes, right? Like the Bible says that it rains on the just and the unjust, right? So basically, that like hard times, right? Sometimes it's just going to happen to us regardless, right? And again, it goes back to what I said in the beginning, that not everything is a curse, okay? So just because you may be going through something, or maybe you are having health issues, it doesn't mean automatically that it is a curse, even though we read from like, um, what was it? From Exodus, right? Doesn't necessarily mean it is, right? And sometimes God puts us through different situations and seasons to stretch us and test us. And, and God did definitely do that with my heart when I was in the middle of the whole illness thing too, because, again, he taught me about gratitude. He literally taught me so many tools, even in regards to like healing and understanding like nutrition and diet and herbs and all these things. And I literally got healed. I think it was like a couple months before 2020, the whole thing happened, right? And so at this point, I already had dealt with a political disease, and now there was another political disease, right? That was being broadcast all over the world, and we were being told that we would have to do certain things to keep us safe. And I'm sitting here like, oh, I already know what I can take for this. I already know what supplements I can take. I already know what herbs are good for something like this, if it's really a virus and whatever, right? And so it's almost like God prepared me for it all, so that when that stuff came around, I was already equipped with enough knowledge to know that I didn't have to do certain things, if that makes sense, if you're catching my drift, right? And so so he did use it, right? Again, the enemy always has plans for evil. The enemy will try to do things to discourage and whatever, right? But God can turn those things around for good. So even though it was a horrible time, okay, like I'm not going to say it was like fun, because it wasn't, but even though I went through that, he literally taught me so many things. And I never thought I would say this ever, but I am grateful now for what I went through and for what I did have to learn. And also, not only did he teach me things, right? He also softened my heart to show me how bad it feels to be in a place like that when you are alone and when maybe you feel like you don't have a lot of support. So that now, as a believer, I can sit with people who are maybe dealing with similar things. Maybe they haven't had their healing yet. Maybe they're waiting for something and it hasn't come to pass yet. But I have that empathy now where I can listen to them and, I don't have to tell them things like, oh, you just need to pray more, or oh, you just, you don't have enough faith, because those things are so damaging to the body of Christ. And like, don't get me wrong, absolutely, we should be praying. And absolutely, we should be seeking God for certain things, right? But it reminds me of Job and his friends when Job was going through, his seasons of intense suffering, right? He needed his friends to just be there. That's it, right? And unfortunately, his friends got to the point where they were like, "What's wrong with you, Job? You must have done something to deserve this." And, God has been showing me that as, the church, the body of Christ, unfortunately, it's become too common for us to not show that agape love to people who really are suffering, in the sense that we don't really want to listen. Like, if it's just too much, right? If people are going through painful situations and we don't really know what to say or whatever, we just don't want to go there. We don't want to listen. It's just not my problem, right? But because of what I went through, it's like now I actually have a desire to be there for people who are really struggling, because again, I know what it's like to be in that place because I was there for so long and I felt alone and I felt isolated and I felt like nobody could understand what I was going through. And so even to this day, God has brought people in my life that are dealing with health stuff right now. And I've been able to just listen to them, let them vent. And even when they talk about the wrestling that they have with God, I'm like, I've been there too. I understand it. And so, not that I'm here to encourage people and say, hey, just walk away from God. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, I'm giving people a space to be able to just express their feelings the same way that the psalmists did, right? Like David and other people who contributed to the Psalms, right? There were moments where they would cry out and they would say, how long, oh Lord, are my enemies going to prosper? Right? And so, when people are going through these things, these very real situations, you know, again, without me going through what I went through, I don't think I would have the same desire to actually be there for other people. And I love encouraging people. That's like one of my gifts that like I know God has given me. He's given me a few different gifts, some that I'm like, I would rather not have that, but that's okay, God. It's okay. It's okay. But like, that's a gift that like he's given me ever since I was young, but it's really been he's been cultivating it through suffering, right? And so I've had friends, over the past few years who have gone to jail. I've had friends who have been homeless, friends who've been living out of their car. I've had friends who have been threatened. I had like it has been a crazy season for a lot of people. I've had friends who are dealing with marriages that are dissolving, right? And so it's almost like God has given me a ministry of encouragement, right? To let people know not to give up. But again, it was born out of suffering. Like it really was, right? And so I end it with that to encourage you and let you know that through Christ, right, we are victorious. We don't have to worry about these things anymore from, our forefathers and whatever, right? Come out of agreement with it, pray, and see if, whatever you're dealing with, see if maybe it helps your situation. If not, it doesn't hurt to pray, right? It doesn't hurt to pray these things, right? And sometimes this is the thing too, a lot of people may have this in their family line, but they just may not know, because a lot of times, right, unless they had parents who were vocal about it, or unless they grew up in it, right, a lot of times people don't know that this was a thing. Anyways, as I was saying, a lot of times people really just don't know. They don't know that, like, maybe, somebody like generations past was involved in certain things, right? Because how are they going to know? Especially if they've never met the person, right? So it doesn't hurt. So I say that to encourage you, to let you know that, like, you know, there is freedom available, right? And, Christ became a curse for us when he was on that cross. And so because of that, right, we have the power to break any curses, right? Past and present. And so I just want to encourage you with that. And then also let you know that, like, God will use your situation that, again, is really hard. It may not make any sense, but he will use it to develop certain things in you. He's going to use those things for your good, the same way he did with me. And so, yeah, so that's it. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you guys. Let me just take a look at my notes to see if there's anything else I missed here. Yeah, no, that was pretty much it. So that's what happened to me. I'm better now. And, whatever you're going through, I just want to encourage you to not give up, right? Galatians 6:9 tells us that, for we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. So I know it may be hard. I know there's a lot of things that are going on. And I know, that sometimes we are being persecuted. Sometimes, there's things, right? We live in a world where the enemy is, like I said in the beginning, right? He's roaming around seeking whom he may devour. So it is a thing. It does happen. But the beautiful thing is, again, right? We have the victory through Jesus, right? So we don't have to worry. We don't have to fear. And yeah, just know that God is going to be with you. He will never leave you or forsake you, even though it may feel like it sometimes, right? But just remember that our feelings don't dictate reality. Um, and it's hard to even say that, because it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to be in that place where your feelings feel like they are dictating your reality. But just know that just because your situation looks one way doesn't mean it's going to be like that forever. And yeah, I think I need to get some sleep because I haven't slept yet. And I'm getting tired. And oh man, yeah. And I can tell my lazy eye's starting to get lazy. And it's like, see, I would love to just be able to record videos without my glasses, but my lazy eye won't let me be great. It won't let me be great. And that's one of the side effects that I think was from my Lyme disease, because growing up, I never had any issues with my eyes. And then when I had Lyme, my eye, that's the one thing. My old pastor used to say, God left me a little something, something to keep me humble. And this, this is one of those things. And again, it's not the end of the world. Other than that, I'm fine. Um, but yeah, I hope this encourages you. I hope this blesses you, and I hope this makes sense. Again, I'm not an expert by any means on this. This is literally just what happened to me, so I'm sharing my story. And yeah, so until next time, you guys have an amazing rest of your day. I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye.